I am Emily Richardson, 29 years old. Until 8 weeks ago, I was just an ordinary veterinarian working at a small animal clinic in suburban Connecticut, living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment with my rescue dog Luna. My great-aunt Margaret and great-uncle Theodore raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. They were wealthy but lived simply, teaching me that character matters more than cash, and that kindness toward all living creatures was the highest virtue. When they passed away in their sleep within days of each other, I was devastated. Then came the lawyer meeting where I learned they had left me their entire $35 million estate. The family who barely acknowledged my existence suddenly wanted everything. I refused. If you want to see money reveal people's darkest secrets, keep reading. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about family showing their true colors. Growing up, my biological parents, Sarah and Michael Richardson, were loving but struggled financially. My father worked as a mechanic while my mother was a part-time secretary. They did their best, but money was always tight. When they died in that terrible accident, I was orphaned at 7 years old. That's when Margaret and Theodore stepped in. Margaret was my grandmother's younger sister, and Theodore was a successful businessman who had built a chain of veterinary clinics across New England. They had never had children of their own, pouring their energy instead into their businesses and charitable work. When I came to live with them, their sprawling colonial home in Westfield became my sanctuary. Despite their considerable wealth, Aunt Margaret and Uncle Theodore lived modestly. Their house was comfortable but not ostentatious. Uncle Theodore drove the same Ford pickup truck for 15 years, while Aunt Margaret shopped with coupons and grew vegetables in their backyard garden. They taught me that money was a tool for good, not a measure of self-worth. "Emily," Uncle Theodore would say as we worked in his workshop, building birdhouses for the local nature preserve, "wealth means nothing if you don't use it to make the world better. Every dollar you have is a chance to help someone or something that needs it." Aunt Margaret reinforced these values daily. She volunteered at the animal shelter, fostered dozens of rescue cats over the years, and quietly paid veterinary bills for families who couldn't afford them. She taught me to see every creature, no matter how small or damaged, as worthy of love and care. This philosophy created a rift with the rest of the family. My father's siblings, Uncle Robert, Aunt Patricia, and Aunt Linda, had always resented Margaret and Theodore's wealth. As the poor relatives, they felt entitled to financial help but scorned the simple lifestyle my guardians chose. Uncle Robert, the eldest sibling, had spent years bouncing between failed business ventures, always with his hand out for loans that were never repaid. He lived in an expensive house he couldn't afford, drove luxury cars on lease, and sent his 3 children to private schools while struggling to pay the bills. He saw Margaret and Theodore's frugality as selfishness, especially since they were wasting money on animal charities instead of helping family. Aunt Patricia was bitter about her own modest teacher's salary, constantly complaining that Margaret and Theodore could easily pay off her credit card debts if they cared about family. She had 2 teenagers who barely knew I existed, despite living only an hour away. Aunt Linda, the youngest, had married young and divorced twice, each time expecting family support to get back on her feet. She worked sporadically as a real estate agent, spending more money on her appearance than she earned, and frequently hinted that Margaret and Theodore should help family first before giving to animal causes. For me, Margaret and Theodore took a completely different approach. They paid for my education in full, but encouraged me to choose a career based on passion rather than profit. When I decided to become a veterinarian like Uncle Theodore, they were thrilled, even though my starting salary would be modest. Throughout my childhood and teenage years, I maintained virtually no relationship with my father's siblings. They rarely visited, and when they did, it was always to ask for money. Margaret and Theodore would politely decline, which would lead to arguments about family loyalty and accusations of favoritism toward me. I grew up hearing whispered conversations about how I was lucky to be taken in by the rich relatives, as if my parents' death was somehow a fortunate circumstance. The extended family treated me like an outsider who had won some genetic lottery, not as a grieving child who had lost everything. During holidays, I often chose to stay home with Margaret and Theodore rather than attend larger family gatherings where I felt unwelcome. This caused even more resentment, with relatives claiming I was being turned against them by my guardians. After graduating from veterinary school, I found work at Westfield Animal Hospital, a small clinic that specialized in treating both pets and rescued wildlife. My apartment was tiny but cozy, decorated with photos of animals I had helped save and plants that Margaret had taught me to grow. My salary covered my needs, and I found deep satisfaction in my work, especially when I could help animals that others had given up on. Margaret and Theodore respected my independence, though they occasionally surprised me with practical gifts like new winter tires for my car or a high-quality microscope for examining tissue samples. They never made me feel indebted or obligated. Our relationship was built on genuine affection and shared values. Every Sunday, I had dinner with them and we would talk about everything: the animals I was treating, books we were reading, places we hoped to travel someday. Theodore taught me chess and woodworking, while Margaret showed me advanced gardening techniques and shared stories about the rescue animals she fostered. 8 weeks ago, everything changed. I was reviewing X-rays of an injured hawk on a quiet Tuesday evening when I received a call from Mrs. Henderson, their longtime housekeeper. Margaret and Theodore had died in their sleep, just 3 days apart. Theodore went first and Margaret followed, as if she couldn't bear to live without her partner of 48 years. The funeral was surreal. I had been preparing for this day for years, knowing they were in their 80s, but nothing could have prepared me for the finality of losing the two people who had saved me and shaped me. My father's siblings attended the funeral, of course, along with their children and spouses. Uncle Robert wore an expensive black suit and spoke eloquently about family bonds and shared memories. Aunt Patricia cried dramatically during the service, though I couldn't remember her visiting Margaret and Theodore more than twice in the past 5 years. Aunt Linda posted photos of herself at the funeral on social media, captioning them with quotes about celebrating life and family legacy. Their adult children, my cousins Kevin, Brandon, Jessica, Mark, and Sophia, stood awkwardly around me, offering brief condolences before clustering together and talking in hushed tones about things I couldn't quite hear. I felt completely alone despite being surrounded by family. These people were strangers to me, and I was clearly a stranger to them. The two people who had truly known and loved me were gone forever. After the funeral, I returned to my apartment and took bereavement leave from the clinic. I spent days walking Luna through the woods, trying to process my grief and adjust to a world without Margaret and Theodore's steady presence. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from James Mitchell, Margaret and Theodore's attorney. He requested that I, along with my surviving relatives, come to his office for the reading of the will. I had expected this, but nothing could have prepared me for what followed. The morning of the will reading was gray and cold, matching my emotional state perfectly. I arrived at Mitchell & Associates 15 minutes early, dressed in a simple black dress and carrying the leather portfolio that Theodore had given me when I graduated veterinary school. The law office occupied a renovated brownstone in downtown Hartford, its interior warm with Persian rugs and antique furniture. James Mitchell greeted me with a firm handshake. He was in his 70s with distinguished silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Emily, I'm so very sorry for your loss," he said gently. "Margaret and Theodore spoke of you constantly. They were so proud of the woman you'd become." His sincere emotion brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. They were everything to me." Before we could continue, the reception door opened and my relatives arrived en masse. Uncle Robert entered first, checking his gold watch and adjusting his expensive tie. At 58, he carried himself with the false confidence of a man constantly trying to impress others. His wife, Diane, followed, her designer handbag probably costing more than I made in a month. Behind them came their 3 adult children: Kevin, 32 and perpetually unemployed despite his MBA, Brandon, 28 and working sporadically in sales, and Jessica, 25 and fresh from an expensive graduate program in art history that had yielded no job prospects. Aunt Patricia arrived next with her husband Gary, a quiet man who always seemed apologetic about existing. Their children, Mark and Sophia, both in their early 20s, trailed behind, looking bored and checking their phones. Aunt Linda swept in last, wearing all black as if she were the chief mourner, her third husband Derek following silently behind her like a shadow. "Well, let's get this over with," Uncle Robert announced without bothering with greetings. "Some of us have businesses to run." James Mitchell's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Robert. Please, everyone follow me to the conference room." The tension was palpable as we arranged ourselves around a large mahogany table. Uncle Robert positioned himself at one end as if claiming authority, while I chose a seat near Mr. Mitchell. The others spread out according to their usual family alliances. "Before we begin," Mr. Mitchell said, "I want to clarify that Margaret and Theodore were of completely sound mind when they finalized their will last year. They were thorough in their considerations and explicit in their wishes. I have documentation from 3 independent physicians certifying their mental competence." Uncle Robert waved dismissively. "Just read it, Jim. We all know how this works. The estate gets divided among the surviving family members. Standard procedure." Mr. Mitchell ignored the interruption and opened a thick leather portfolio. He adjusted his glasses and began reading the formal legal language. My relative shifted impatiently as he worked through the standard revocations and appointments. Finally, he reached the section everyone was waiting for. "We hereby bequeath our entire estate, including but not limited to all cash assets totaling approximately $12 million, our investment portfolio valued at approximately $15 million, all real estate holdings including our primary residence valued at $6 million, and our ownership stakes in Theodore's veterinary clinics valued at approximately $2 million. To our beloved great-niece, Emily Sarah Richardson." The room went completely silent. I stopped breathing, certain I had misheard. Mr. Mitchell continued reading, "We specifically and intentionally make no provisions for Robert Richardson, Patricia Williams, Linda Martinez, or any of their children, as we have observed their character and values over many years and find them incompatible with our wishes for how this wealth should be used." "What?" Uncle Robert shouted, leaping to his feet so violently his chair toppled backward. "Let me see that document." He lunged for the will, but Mr. Mitchell calmly moved it out of reach. "Robert, please sit down. There's more." Aunt Patricia's face had gone white. $35 million? To Emily? This is insane. She's just a veterinarian. "What about us?" Kevin demanded, his usual lazy demeanor replaced by sharp anger. "We're family too. I need capital for my consulting business." Aunt Linda turned to me, her eyes blazing. "What did you do? How did you manipulate them into this?" I sat in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. $35 million. My modest aunt and uncle had accumulated that much wealth, and they had left all of it to me. "If everyone would please take their seats," Mr. Mitchell said firmly. "Margaret and Theodore recorded a video message to be played at this time." He pressed a button on a remote control, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. My aunt and uncle appeared, sitting together on their familiar living room sofa. My heart clenched at seeing them alive again. Uncle Theodore spoke first, his voice as warm and steady as I remembered. "If you're watching this, it means Margaret and I have passed on, and our family is gathering to learn about our final wishes." Aunt Margaret continued, "We want to explain our decisions directly to prevent any confusion or hurt feelings, though we suspect there will be both." For the next 20 minutes, they carefully explained their reasoning. They had watched my father's siblings for decades, observing how they prioritized material wealth over relationships, how they treated Margaret and Theodore as resources to be tapped rather than family to be cherished. "Robert," Uncle Theodore said, looking directly into the camera, "you have borrowed over $400,000 from us over the years, promising to repay money you never intended to return. You've missed family gatherings because you were too busy, but you always found time to visit when you needed financial help. Patricia," Aunt Margaret added, "you've blamed us for your financial problems while spending money you didn't have on luxuries you didn't need. You taught your children that we owed them something simply because we were related. Linda, you've treated our home like a bank, expecting us to fund your lifestyle choices while showing no interest in our lives, our work, or our values. They went on to detail specific incidents: missed birthdays, ignored invitations, holidays spent alone while relatives vacationed on money borrowed from them. They spoke of watching their great-nieces and great-nephews grow up without knowing their names or ages, despite living relatively nearby. Emily, Uncle Theodore said, his voice becoming tender, is the only one who chose to know us as people, not as sources of money. She visits because she cares, not because she wants something. She chose a career helping animals despite the modest pay because it fulfills her purpose. We trust Emily to honor our values and use these resources wisely, Aunt Margaret added. She understands that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. The video continued with their hopes for how the inheritance might be used supporting animal welfare, environmental conservation, and education. They had established detailed guidelines and suggested trusted advisors to help me navigate the responsibility. As the screen went dark, Uncle Robert exploded. This is garbage. They were clearly manipulated. No sane person leaves $35 million to someone who makes $40,000 a year. Mr. Mitchell remained perfectly calm. They anticipated this response, Robert. As I mentioned, they underwent extensive cognitive testing. Additionally, I have documented every loan request, every missed occasion, and every interaction over the past 15 years. Contesting this would be expensive and ultimately futile. Aunt Patricia turned to me, her voice suddenly honey-sweet. Emily, sweetheart, you understand this isn't right. Your aunt and uncle were confused in their old age. This money belongs to the whole family. You'll share it with us, won't you? All eyes focused on me. I felt cornered and overwhelmed. I need time to process this, I stammered. I had no idea they would do this. Process what? Kevin scoffed. There's nothing to process. That money should be divided equally among all the family members. Or managed by someone with actual business experience, Uncle Robert interjected, clearly meaning himself. As the arguing intensified, Mr. Mitchell gently touched my arm. You don't have to decide anything today, Emily. Take all the time you need. He handed me a thick envelope. This contains all the relevant documents, keys to their house, and contact information for their financial advisors. Call me with any questions. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, with threats of lawsuits and accusations flying. Mr. Mitchell eventually asked everyone to leave, stating he had another appointment. But before anyone could move, Uncle Robert's phone rang. He answered it aggressively, barking, "What?" into the device. His face went pale as he listened, then red with anger. "What do you mean the loan was called in?" He shouted into the phone, causing everyone to freeze. "I have 30 days. You can't just..." He trailed off, listening, then hung up without another word. The room was silent for a moment before Diane whispered urgently, "What's wrong?" Uncle Robert's composure cracked completely. "The bank. They're accelerating the loan on the business. Apparently, they heard about Dad's estate and assumed." He glanced around the room, his eyes settling on me with undisguised hatred. "They want full payment within 10 days or they foreclose." "How much?" Kevin asked, though from his pale expression he already suspected. $2.8 million, Uncle Robert said flatly. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. I realized with sick clarity that Uncle Robert hadn't just wanted the inheritance, he had needed it desperately. His business was failing, and he had been counting on Margaret and Theodore's money to save it. Aunt Patricia broke the silence. "Well, this makes it even more important that we resolve this family matter quickly." She turned to me with desperate eyes. "Emily, you see now why this inheritance needs to be handled properly. Your uncle could lose everything he's worked for his entire life." "Everything he's worked for?" I found my voice, though it shook with emotion. "What about everything Margaret and Theodore worked for? What about their wishes? Their values?" "Values don't pay mortgages," Uncle Robert snarled. Values don't save businesses or put food on tables. Mr. Mitchell cleared his throat. Perhaps this conversation should continue at another time, when emotions aren't running quite so high. No, Uncle Robert said firmly. We settle this now. He turned to me. Emily, I'm going to be very clear. That money could save not just my business, but everything our family has built. Are you really going to let pride and some sentimental notion about what two old people wanted destroy the livelihood of dozens of employees? Are you going to let my children lose their inheritance because you're being stubborn? The emotional manipulation was obvious, but it still stung. I looked around the room at the faces of people who had shared holidays with me, who had been present at family gatherings throughout my childhood, even if they had never truly seen me. Kevin stepped forward. Emily, I know we haven't been close, but we are family. Dad's business employs 43 people. If it goes under, that's 43 families who lose their income right before the holidays. Jessica added quietly, some of those employees have been with the company for over 10 years. They have kids, mortgages. The weight of their words pressed down on me. I had never considered that my decision might affect innocent people beyond my immediate family. But then I remembered Uncle Theodore's voice from the video. Emily understands that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. I understand that people's jobs are at stake, I said slowly. But Margaret and Theodore's money isn't the solution to your business problems, Uncle Robert. If you've been running the company poorly enough that one lone call can destroy it, then maybe the problem isn't lack of capital. His face darkened dangerously. How dare you lecture me about business? You treat sick cats for a living. And you've borrowed $400,000 from Margaret and Theodore over the years without paying back a penny, I shot back, surprising myself with my boldness. Maybe if you had honored your debts to them, you wouldn't be in this situation now. The room erupted again, but Mr. Mitchell stood up authoritatively. That's enough. Everyone needs to leave my office immediately. Emily, please remain behind for a moment. As my relatives filed out, Uncle Robert grabbed my arm roughly. This conversation isn't over, he hissed. Come to my house tonight at 7. We'll sort this out as a family, and Emily, think very carefully about those 43 jobs. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. I nodded numbly, too overwhelmed to argue, and acutely aware that the stakes had just become much higher than family harmony. I spent the afternoon driving aimlessly through the Connecticut countryside, the envelope from Mr. Mitchell sitting unopened on my passenger seat. Part of me wanted to peek inside and understand exactly what Margaret and Theodore had entrusted to me. Another part was terrified of the responsibility it represented. But as I drove past familiar landmarks, the farm stand where Margaret and I bought fresh strawberries every summer, the hiking trail where Theodore taught me to identify different types of oak trees, the small church where they had quietly funded repairs to the steeple, I began to feel their presence guiding me. I pulled into a small parking area overlooking the Connecticut River and finally opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of documents, but the first thing I found was a handwritten letter from Aunt Margaret, dated just 3 months before her death. My dearest Emily, it began in her familiar, elegant script. If you're reading this, it means Theodore and I are no longer with you, and you've learned about our decision regarding the estate. I imagine you're feeling overwhelmed, confused, and perhaps even angry at us for placing this burden on your shoulders. Please know that this decision wasn't made lightly. We've watched our family for decades, and we've seen how money changes people, sometimes for the better, but more often for the worse. We've seen Robert's business struggles, Patricia's resentment, Linda's endless crises. We've given them money, advice, and opportunities, but nothing we provided ever seemed to satisfy them or improve their character. You, however, have shown us something different. You chose a career that helps others despite the modest financial rewards. You visit us not because you want something, but because you genuinely care about our well-being. You remember our birthdays, our anniversary, the little details that matter to lonely old people. More importantly, you share our values. You see animals not as property or profit, but as living beings deserving of compassion and care. You understand that wealth is a tool for good, not a measure of personal worth. We know this inheritance will change your life dramatically, and probably not in ways that feel comfortable at first. People will treat you differently. Family members will make demands. Strangers will approach you with sob stories and investment opportunities. You'll question every friendship, every relationship, wondering if people like you for yourself or for your money. But Emily, we believe you have the strength and wisdom to navigate these challenges. We've given you not just money, but the resources and support network to use it well. James Mitchell will guide you legally, our financial advisors will help you manage the investments, and our longtime friends will offer perspective when the pressure becomes too much. The veterinary clinics are profitable and well-run. Rosa Martinez, Theodore's business partner, will help you understand them. Don't feel pressured to take an active role if that's not what you want. You can remain a silent partner and still honor Theodore's vision for compassionate veterinary care. The house holds so many memories of our life together, but it's also meant to be lived in, not turned into a shrine. Make it your own. Change what needs changing, keep what brings you joy. Most importantly, remember that this money comes with a moral obligation. We accumulated it not for luxury or status, but as a tool for making the world better. How you choose to do that is up to you, but we trust your judgment completely. The family may pressure you, manipulate you, even threaten you. They may claim we were senile or that you manipulated us. Don't let them make you doubt yourself or our love for you. Every decision we made was careful, deliberate, and based on decades of observation. You are the daughter we never had, Emily. You are our legacy, not just financially but morally and spiritually. We couldn't be more proud of the woman you've become or more confident in the woman you'll continue to be. All our love, Aunt Margaret and Uncle Theodore. P.S. There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank containing some jewelry that belonged to my mother and grandmother. It's yours now, but more than that, it's a connection to the women who came before you. We always hoped you might have a daughter someday to pass it on to. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of gratitude and determination. They had known exactly what I would face, and they had prepared me for it as much as possible. I looked through more documents, detailed financial reports, property deeds, business records. The scope of what they had built was staggering, but so was their systematic generosity. Hidden in the papers were records of scholarships they had funded anonymously, veterinary bills they had paid for families in need, donations to animal shelters across 3 states. They had been living their values all along, and now they were trusting me to continue that work on a much larger scale. As I drove toward Uncle Robert's house, I felt calmer and more centered than I had all day. I knew what I was walking into, and I knew what I had to do. At 6:45, I pulled into Uncle Robert's circular driveway, noting that everyone else had already arrived. Their 6,000-square-foot McMansion loomed before me, all stone and glass designed to impress rather than welcome. But I wasn't intimidated anymore. I had read Margaret's letter, and I knew who I was and what I stood for. I took a deep breath, clutched the letter in my pocket like a talisman, and headed inside. They were waiting in the formal living room, a space that always felt more like a furniture showroom than a place where people actually lived. Uncle Robert stood by the fireplace, brandy snifter in hand, while Diane perched on the edge of a designer sofa. Kevin sprawled across an armchair, scrolling through his phone, while Jessica and Brandon whispered urgently to each other. Aunt Patricia paced nervously while Gary stood by the window, looking like he wished he could escape. Mark and Sophia sat together, both looking uncomfortable. Aunt Linda held court from another armchair, Derek standing behind her like a bodyguard. "Finally," Uncle Robert said when I entered. "Sit down, Emily." I chose a chair near the door, suddenly aware I might need a quick exit. "Let's be reasonable about this," Uncle Robert began, his business negotiation voice in full effect. Margaret and Theodore clearly weren't thinking straight in their final years. They meant for the family to benefit, not just you. Diane nodded enthusiastically. "Sweetie, managing that kind of wealth is incredibly complicated. Your uncle has the experience to handle it properly. You could still receive a generous portion, maybe enough for a nice house instead of that little apartment." The condescension in her voice made my skin crawl, but I remained silent. "Here's what we propose," Uncle Robert continued. "You sign over the estate to me as the head of the family. I'll ensure everyone gets their fair share. You'll receive 10%, which is more than generous considering your limited financial needs." 10%. I finally found my voice. That would be $3.5 million. Exactly, Kevin jumped in. More money than you could spend in a lifetime on a veterinarian's budget. I need at least $8 million for my consulting firm expansion. It's going to revolutionize business efficiency. I looked at him skeptically. Kevin had been launching various business ventures for years, none lasting more than 6 months. His last endeavor, a social media app for pet owners, had collapsed after burning through $75,000 of his parents' money. "The house should come to us," Aunt Patricia interjected. "Gary and I have been looking at downsizing, and that neighborhood has excellent schools for when Mark and Sophia have children." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Aunt Patricia had visited Margaret and Theodore's house maybe 5 times in the past decade. Her children were complete strangers to me, and the idea of them inheriting the home where I'd been raised felt like a violation. "I need help with Derek's medical bills," Aunt Linda added. "His back surgery wasn't fully covered by insurance. Family should help family in times of need." As the evening progressed, their tactics evolved. When demands didn't work, they switched to guilt. "After everything this family has been through," Aunt Patricia said, her eyes dramatically moist, "losing your parents so young, then Margaret and Theodore, we should be coming together, not letting money drive us apart. This is what your parents would have wanted, their daughter sharing with their siblings' children." I nearly choked on my water. When was the last time any of you even mentioned my parents? When did you ever acknowledge the anniversary of their death or ask how I was coping? The room went uncomfortably silent. Uncle Robert changed strategies. "We're not asking, Emily. We're telling you what's going to happen. Either you sign the transfer documents voluntarily, or we can test the will. We'll bring up every questionable interaction you had with Margaret and Theodore. How often were you alone with them? What did you tell them about us? We'll paint you as a manipulative gold digger who took advantage of elderly relatives." The threat hung in the air like poison. I felt sick, but something inside me hardened. I remembered Uncle Theodore teaching me to stand up to a playground bully when I was 10. "Never let anyone take your dignity, Emily," he had said. "Know what's right and stand firm." Derek, who had remained silent all evening, suddenly spoke up. "Maybe we should give Emily some time to think about this. It's a lot to process." Uncle Robert rounded on him. "Stay out of this, Derek. This is family business." "Emily is family," he responded quietly, but immediately retreated when Uncle Robert glared at him. As the clock ticked past 10, Jessica started drafting transfer documents on her laptop. Diane called their personal attorney for advice on the wording. Kevin scrolled through real estate websites, already planning how to spend his share. The surreal nature of the evening struck me as I watched my relatives dividing money that wasn't theirs with the casual efficiency of corporate raiders. Uncle Robert had produced a yellow legal pad and was making columns of expenses. Robert business debts, $2.8 million, house renovation, $500,000, Kevin's consulting firm, $3 million, Jessica's art gallery, $2 million. Aunt Patricia leaned over his shoulder, adding her own items. Mark's wedding, $75,000, Sophia's graduate school, $120,000, our kitchen remodel, $80,000. Even Aunt Linda got involved, despite having contributed nothing to the conversation all evening. Derek's medical bills, $45,000, new car, mine is 8 years old, $60,000, Florida condo down payment, $200,000. I watched this grotesque accounting in fascination and horror. They were spending $35 million as casually as if they were splitting a dinner check, each person claiming their share without any consideration of what Margaret and Theodore had actually wanted. "What about taxes?" Derek asked quietly, the first substantive thing he'd said all evening. Uncle Robert waved dismissively. "Emily can handle that out of her portion. She's getting plenty. Actually, I said, surprising myself by speaking up, inheritance taxes on an estate this size could be substantial. Has anyone calculated what the net amount would actually be after federal and state taxes? The room went quiet. Clearly, no one had considered this detail. That's what accountants are for, Uncle Robert said after a moment, but his confidence seemed shaken. And what about the veterinary clinics? I continued, feeling emboldened by their obvious lack of preparation. Those are operating businesses with employees, leases, equipment loans. You can't just liquidate them without significant financial and legal consequences. Kevin looked up from his laptop. We'll sell them. Turn them into cash. To whom? At what price? On what timeline? I pressed. Do any of you understand how much those businesses are actually worth, or how long it typically takes to sell a veterinary practice? The questions hung in the air, revealing the fundamental flaw in their plan. They had assumed the inheritance was simply a pile of cash waiting to be divided, not a complex estate with multiple components, tax implications, and legal obligations. Diane tried to regain control of the conversation. Emily, sweetie, these are exactly the kinds of details your uncle can handle. That's why it makes sense for him to manage everything. Manage it how? I asked. He's facing bankruptcy in his own business. His loan was called in today. What expertise does he have in estate management or tax planning? Uncle Robert's face darkened. My business problems are temporary setbacks. I've been managing complex finances for 20 years. By borrowing money from Margaret and Theodore that you never repaid? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't regret them. The room erupted again, but this time I felt different. Instead of shrinking back from their anger, I felt a strange calm settling over me. These people were making demands about money they had never earned, planning expenditures for assets they had never managed, and criticizing decisions they had never had to make. You know what I find interesting? I said, my voice cutting through their arguments. Not one person in this room has asked what Margaret and Theodore would have wanted. Not one of you has mentioned their values, their vision, or their lifetime of work. You're treating their legacy like it's lottery winnings that should be split up and spent as quickly as possible. They're dead, Emily, Kevin said bluntly. What they wanted doesn't matter anymore. The callousness of that statement took my breath away. It doesn't matter? Their entire life's work doesn't matter? What matters, Uncle Robert said firmly, is taking care of the living. That's what family does. Is it? I stood up, suddenly unable to remain seated. Because I don't remember any of you taking care of Margaret and Theodore when they were living. I don't remember you visiting when Uncle Theodore had his heart surgery 3 years ago. I don't remember you helping when Aunt Margaret broke her hip and needed assistance with daily tasks. Aunt Patricia opened her mouth to protest, but I continued. I was there every week, sometimes every day. I drove them to doctor appointments, helped with grocery shopping, sat with them when they were scared or lonely. Where were all of you during those years? You lived nearby, Aunt Linda said defensively. It was easier for you. It was easier for me? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I worked 50-hour weeks at the clinic, lived in a tiny apartment, drove a 10-year-old car. But I made time because I loved them. Because they were family. Not because I expected anything in return. The room had gone quiet again, but this time it felt different. For the first time all evening, some of them looked uncomfortable, even guilty. They watched all of this, I continued. They saw who showed up and who didn't. They saw who called just to chat and who only called when they needed money. They made their decision based on 40 years of observation, not some sentimental whim. Uncle Robert had been growing redder throughout my speech. You self-righteous little. That's enough, Robert, Derek interrupted, speaking more forcefully than I'd ever heard him. She's right and you know it. Everyone turned to stare at him in shock. Derek had never contradicted anyone in the family, certainly not Uncle Robert. You want to know why Margaret and Theodore made this decision? Derek continued. Because Emily is the only one who ever treated them like people instead of ATMs. The only one who remembered their birthdays, their anniversary, their favorite foods. The only one who listened to their stories and cared about their opinions. Aunt Linda grabbed his arm. "Derek, stop." But he shook her off. "No, Linda. I've watched this family for 15 years, and I've seen how you all treat each other when money is involved. Emily deserved this inheritance because she's the only one who didn't want it for selfish reasons." The truth of his words seemed to hit everyone simultaneously. Even Kevin stopped typing and looked up with something like shame in his eyes. But Uncle Robert recovered quickly. "Very touching speech, Derek, but it doesn't change the practical reality. Emily can't handle this kind of money responsibly. She needs family guidance." "Guidance from people who are facing bankruptcy and foreclosure?" I asked quietly. "Guidance from people who want to spend money on art galleries and Florida condos while 43 employees are about to lose their jobs?" That stopped him cold. They had divided my inheritance in their minds without my consent, mapping out how they would spend every dollar. Not once did anyone mention Margaret and Theodore's wishes or their vision for how the money should be used. At 11:30, Uncle Robert printed out the transfer document and slid it across the coffee table to me, along with a gold pen. "Sign it," he demanded. I picked up the paper and read it carefully. The language was broad, essentially signing away all rights to anything Margaret and Theodore had left me. In exchange, I would receive a percentage to be determined later at Uncle Robert's sole discretion. I put the paper down and took a deep breath. "No." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. "What did you just say?" Uncle Robert asked, his voice dangerously low. I said no. I won't sign this or anything like it. Margaret and Theodore trusted me with their legacy for a reason. I intend to honor that trust. Diane launched into a tirade about ingratitude and family loyalty. Kevin called me names I won't repeat. Aunt Patricia began sobbing dramatically about her children's futures being destroyed by my selfishness. Through it all, I sat still, the word no becoming armor around me. Finally, Uncle Robert slammed his brandy snifter down so hard it shattered against the marble coffee table. "That's enough," he roared. "I always knew you couldn't be trusted. You manipulated them against their own family." He stalked toward me, pointing his finger inches from my face. "You have a choice to make right now, Emily. Either you sign that paper and remain part of this family, or you take your precious inheritance and consider yourself dead to us. You can't have both." The ultimatum hung between us like a blade. I looked around at the faces of my relatives, searching for any sign of love or understanding. I found none. In that moment, I realized a painful truth. They had never really seen me as family. I was just a potential obstacle to wealth they felt entitled to inherit. "I'm not signing," I said firmly, standing up. "I'm sorry you feel this way, but I have to respect what Margaret and Theodore wanted." "Then get out of my house," Uncle Robert snarled. "And don't come crawling back when you realize what you've thrown away." I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. "I'm not the one throwing away family," I said quietly. "You are." With that, I walked out into the cold night air. The door slammed behind me with disturbing finality. Standing beside my car, I suddenly felt the weight of everything crashing down. In the span of a few hours, I had gained millions but lost the only family I had left, flawed as they were. I sat in my car and finally allowed the tears to come. They streamed down my face as I gripped the steering wheel, great heaving sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for Margaret and Theodore, whose absence felt more acute than ever. I cried for the family I had hoped for but never truly had. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I wiped my eyes and started the car. I drove straight to Margaret and Theodore's house, my house now, using the keys Mr. Mitchell had given me. The porch light was on when I arrived, probably on a timer Uncle Theodore had set months earlier. I sat in the driveway for several minutes, gathering courage to enter the house where I'd been loved unconditionally. The house smelled exactly the same, Aunt Margaret's lavender sachets mixed with the lemon oil Uncle Theodore used on the furniture. I flipped on the lights, half expecting to hear their voices calling from the kitchen. The silence was deafening but somehow comforting. This was my sanctuary now, the place where I could honor their memory and continue their work. That night, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, I made a decision. I would not just inherit Margaret and Theodore's wealth. I would inherit their values, their wisdom, and their commitment to making the world better for all living creatures. The money would be a tool for good, just as they had always taught me. And if that meant losing the relatives who had never truly been family anyway, then so be it. 6 months have passed since that terrible night, and I can honestly say it was the beginning of my real life. The first weeks were challenging, filled with legal paperwork, financial decisions, and the painful process of accepting that my biological family had chosen greed over love. They made several attempts to reconcile, but only when they needed something. Uncle Robert called when his business faced a cash flow crisis, hinting broadly about short-term loans with excellent returns. Aunt Patricia reached out when she heard about my charitable foundation, suddenly wanting to serve on the board. Kevin texted whenever his latest venture failed, asking for startup capital from family. Each time, I politely but firmly maintained the boundaries I had established. I would consider a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine care, but not one based on financial advantage. None of them could meet those simple terms. Instead, I built new traditions with the community Margaret and Theodore had cultivated over decades. Their friends became my advisors and supporters, helping me navigate the complexities of wealth while staying true to the values I'd been taught. I established the Margaret and Theodore Richardson Foundation for Animal Welfare, dedicating $15 million to supporting animal shelters, wildlife rehabilitation centers, and veterinary care for families who couldn't afford it. The foundation also funds research into animal behavior and conservation efforts. I returned to work at the clinic, much to everyone's surprise. My colleagues couldn't understand why I would continue working for a modest salary when I could afford to retire. But the work fulfilled me in ways money never could. I did upgrade our equipment and establish a fund to provide free care for rescue animals and low-income pet owners. With the guidance of Uncle Theodore's former business partners, I learned to manage the veterinary clinics I'd inherited. Rather than sell them, I maintained his philosophy of putting animal welfare before profit, ensuring all locations continued to provide excellent care regardless of owners' ability to pay. Margaret and Theodore's house gradually became home again. I converted Uncle Theodore's workshop into a rehabilitation center for injured wildlife, and transformed Aunt Margaret's garden into a demonstration space for sustainable living practices. Mrs. Henderson, their longtime housekeeper, refused to fully retire despite my insistence she had earned it. She comes 3 times a week, bringing stories about Margaret and Theodore that help keep their memory alive. My extended family made occasional attempts to reestablish contact, though their motives remained transparent. Last month, Jessica called asking for help with her student loans, suddenly interested in getting to know her cousin better. Brandon reached out when his sales job fell through, wondering if I had any opportunities in the veterinary field. The most painful attempt came from Aunt Patricia, who called on the anniversary of my parents' death, the first time she had acknowledged that date in over 20 years. She suggested we should honor their memory by coming together as family, which apparently meant funding Mark's wedding and Sophia's graduate school. Each contact reinforced my decision to maintain boundaries. These weren't people who loved me, they were people who saw me as a resource. Instead, I found family in unexpected places. Dr. Williams, the elderly veterinarian who had mentored me, became like a grandfather figure. Sarah Chen, who ran the local animal shelter, became my closest friend and partner in the foundation's work. The network of animal welfare advocates Margaret and Theodore had supported over the years welcomed me with open arms. 1 year after the will reading, I visited Margaret and Theodore's graves on a crisp autumn morning similar to the day they died. I brought fresh flowers and sat on the small bench nearby, finally ready to have the conversation I'd been avoiding. "I think I'm doing okay," I told them, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking aloud. "The foundation is making a real difference. We've placed over 500 animals in loving homes this year and funded surgeries for dozens more who wouldn't have survived otherwise." A gentle breeze rustled the nearby maple trees, sending golden leaves spiraling down around me. It was the kind of beautiful fall day Aunt Margaret had loved, perfect for working in the garden and watching the birds at her feeders. "I wish you were here to see it all," I continued. "The clinics are thriving and we're opening 2 new locations next year. I'm still learning about business management, but I think you'd be proud of the decisions I'm making." I had discovered so much about their quiet generosity since inheriting. Hidden in their files were records of scholarships they'd funded, medical bills they'd paid, and families they'd helped during difficult times. All done anonymously, without expectation of recognition or thanks. "Thank you for trusting me," I whispered. "I understand now why you made the choice you did. It was never really about the money. It was about finding someone who shared your values and would carry them forward." As I sat there, memories washed over me, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with warm appreciation for the time we'd shared. I remembered Uncle Theodore teaching me to identify bird calls during our morning walks. Aunt Margaret showing me how to make her famous chocolate chip cookies, letting me lick the spoon. Both of them cheering at my veterinary school graduation when no one else from the family bothered to attend. The inheritance had been about more than money. It had been about entrusting me with their life's work, their relationships, and their vision of how wealth could be used to heal rather than harm. Standing to leave, I noticed a small injured sparrow near the base of their headstone, probably stunned by flying into a nearby window. Gently, I scooped it up, feeling its rapid heartbeat against my palms. Its wing was damaged but not broken. With proper care, it would fly again. As I drove to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center with the sparrow resting quietly in a small box on my passenger seat, I smiled at the symbolism. Margaret and Theodore had found me broken by loss and circumstance, nursed me back to health, and taught me to soar. Now it was my turn to do the same for others. That evening, I hosted the Foundation's 2nd annual fundraising dinner. As I watched veterinarians, animal advocates, and compassionate community members gather to support our work, I felt Margaret and Theodore's presence strongly. Among the attendees was Maria Santos, a young woman from a low-income family whose beloved dog had needed emergency surgery we'd funded 6 months earlier. She approached me during the reception, tears in her eyes. "Max is completely recovered," she said, showing me photos on her phone of a happy golden retriever playing in her backyard. "The vet said without that surgery, we would have lost him. He's been part of our family for 8 years. I can't imagine life without him." In that moment, I understood completely what Margaret and Theodore had been building all along. Not just wealth for its own sake, but a legacy of compassion that would ripple outward long after they were gone. They had trusted me to amplify that effect, to carry their values forward in ways they could envision but would never see. The money had indeed revealed true colors, showing me who valued wealth over relationship, who saw me as a means to an end rather than a person deserving of love. But it had also revealed a community of genuine connection, people who had loved Margaret and Theodore for their kindness and generosity, not their bank account. That was the true inheritance, more valuable than any dollar amount. As I continue this journey, I've learned that family isn't defined by blood or legal documents, but by love, respect, and shared commitment to making the world better. The relatives who demanded their fair share were never really family at all. They were just people who happened to share some DNA. My real family consists of the mentors who guide me, the colleagues who support our mission, the community that embraces our work, and the memory of 2 extraordinary people who saw potential in a grieving 7-year-old and nurtured it into something beautiful. The $35 million sits in carefully managed investments and charitable trusts, continuing to grow so it can continue to heal. Every dollar spent honors Margaret and Theodore's memory and values. Every animal saved, every family helped, every life improved carries forward their legacy of compassion. Uncle Robert, Aunt Patricia, and Aunt Linda may have rejected me, but in doing so they freed me to become the person Margaret and Theodore always believed I could be. The person who uses wealth as a tool for good, who sees every creature as deserving of care, and who understands that true family is built on love, not entitlement. Money didn't corrupt me, it revealed who I really was underneath the grief and uncertainty. And it revealed who they really were too. The inheritance wasn't just a test of my character, it was a revelation of everyone's true nature. I passed the test they didn't even know they were taking. And in the process, I found my purpose, my family, and my place in the world. The legacy continues, one rescued animal at a time, one act of compassion at a time, one life made better at a time. Margaret and Theodore would be proud. And that's worth more than all the money in the world.